Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 25th day of July in the year 2017. I say that because I want everybody to know that we are live today. I pinched myself and it actually hurt, so I know I'm still alive. So I've missed being on the program, and I was telling Bob before we came on the air that I'm a little bit nervous. I've been away from the mic for a while, and Bob says it's like riding a bicycle, and I don't know. I never had much of a problem riding a bicycle, but I've had some problems doing this program on a regular basis. But I really do miss it, and I want to thank you all for your continued support of the program. I continue to get an occasional email or posting on the Facebook page or whatever, comment on something that's there. It is a pleasure to be back with you, and I look forward to today's program. As we always do on Tuesdays, we're beginning 30 minutes late today. Tomorrow, we'll be beginning at our regular time, which will be 1 o'clock Eastern Time, Eastern Daylight Time. Let me go through the housekeeping first and let you know that we do have a phone number. Bob is in the studios, and if you call and would like to get on the air, Bob will make that happen. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. Actually, I kind of had a fear today that I'd forget that number. I haven't written it down anywhere. After a while, you remember it by doing it every day. But it's been so long since I did it, I was not sure. I was not sure that I could remember the number, but I did. It's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to email me directly, if you're a little bit reluctant about going on the air and trust me to do it, then I do encourage you to take that route by sending me an email and sharing your thoughts that way. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And then there's our Facebook page. If you are a regular user of Facebook, you know pretty much how easy it is to navigate Facebook. If you go to the homepage of Facebook, facebook.com, there's a search box at the top, and if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page. And since I've been out of town for quite a while, I haven't posted anything for about a week. So it's about time we get to it. In fact, one of the things I'd like to do on today's program is pretty much ready to go. So I think that after the program is over, sometime before we meet again tomorrow, I'll post the piece that I've put together on the Facebook page. So again, it's the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution in the search box on Facebook, and you'll have access to our Facebook page. And we do invite you. There are plenty of opportunities there for you to comment on what's there, the postings that are there. Admittedly, some of them are a week old now, or a little bit better than that. But I'll be updating the Facebook page on a regular basis now that I'm back. I will share with you that I drove to New England and visited family for 6 days, and got to see people that I hadn't seen for, my sister. I hadn't seen her for a while, and so I got to spend 2 evenings with her. And I got to stay with my brother and spent time with nephews and nieces, and it was just wonderful. We had one of these big family gatherings at a restaurant up there, very nice restaurant. I think there were 13 of us, and it was delightful. So everything that I went there to do, I did. The drive was horrendous, naturally. The traffic in New England is pretty tough. and I went up on Sunday. In fact, it's really interesting. I left on Saturday. I intended to leave Saturday morning. I got 2 miles out and ran into a car fire blocking access to the interstate that I needed to get on. And it was pretty obvious that it was going to be a while. And so finally I made the decision that the best thing to do is just turn around and try it again the next day. So I turned around and came back. So that was 4 hours, a little bit better than 4 hours. And I ended up back where I started from. And then the next day, Sunday, I lit out again. And everything went well until I got into New England. And then I ran into one traffic blockage jam after the other. And I think the last 150 miles took me 5 hours or something. So it ended up being almost a 16-hour drive. And it's not anyway, it's somewhere between 11 and a half and 12 and a half usually. And this time it was almost 16. So, but anyway, it's over now. And I'm back in the program and delighted to be here. And I hope everybody is well. And please feel free to contact us and share your thoughts on some of these ideas and some of these issues. What I'd like to do first, and of course I'm here in southern West Virginia, and as you know, we had the honor yesterday of hosting the President of the United States at the Boy Scout Jamboree, which is going on just north of Beckley, where I am now. It's about 6 or 7 miles away from where I'm broadcasting. And I ran into some people that didn't realize what the president coming to a small town like ours means. But you couldn't get out of town. All the roads were blocked and everything else in order to accommodate the president. So I had a good friend that was over here visiting, apparently having dinner or something last night and couldn't get home because all the roads leaving town were blocked. So there are always those negatives. But I have to say, and the president's address to the Boy Scouts, and there were about 30,000 of them. The crowd was huge. This time he can legitimately claim that it was a huge crowd, because it was. It was broadcast live, and I started to watch it live, and I'll be very honest with you, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, so I finally turned it off. I couldn't believe that the president made the kind of what I thought were highly inappropriate comments to a group of Boy Scouts. He opened the address by saying that he wasn't going to do that, that this was the Boy Scouts, these were Boy Scouts, and therefore he didn't want to spend the time talking about politics and elections and fake news and all of that, and that's exactly what he talked about for pretty much the whole address. He took shots at Hillary Clinton, at Barack Obama, at the Democrats, at his Attorney General Sessions, and given the audience, it seemed to me highly inappropriate. And of course, many of the students responded very positively because when you say something straight and a little bit direct about other people, especially prominent people, crowds always react, and this one did as well. And of course, what that does is just fan the president's enthusiasm to talk more and say more. But I did feel that it was highly inappropriate. It was highly inappropriate to mention to the Scouts about supporting his agenda. In fact, I heard one commentator make the comment, and I think it was pretty much on the mark, that everything he did and everything he said contradicted what Boy Scouts are supposed to be about. Everything that they're trained or taught not to do, he did. And I just thought it was highly inappropriate. But again, that kind of thing has happened so frequently that it almost doesn't really warrant comment at least from a number of people. There is something I did want to mention about, and this was just this weekend as well. This past Saturday, the president traveled to Norfolk, Virginia, and launched the new Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. And if my numbers are correct, I think there were 7,000 military personnel, naval midshipmen on that boat. So his audience was again very significant. I listened to the address. I was in the car, and I listened to the entire address. And I made up my mind as I was listening that I was going to raise it here on the program when I got back. Because as part of his address, the president encouraged these sailors to contact their congressmen and do what they could do to pass the budget that he wants passed with the significant increase in military appropriations. And he added, while you're at it, you might tell them you also want your health care. The fact of the matter is, and I know this for a fact, that is exactly the wrong thing to say to a military audience. Men in uniform take an oath to support the President of the United States and the Constitution of the United States, irrespective of party. Military personnel do not and are encouraged never to take political positions on issues. My stepson is an officer in the Navy. And in the years that I've known him, I've watched him literally go to great lengths to not get involved in political discussions or take political positions, because the oath that he took forbids it. For the President of the United States to go up there and encourage 7,000 soldiers to become politically active in violation of their oath, in violation of everything that they are about as military personnel serving at the behest of the commander-in-chief, is beyond inappropriate. It is despicable, I believe. And I had that on my mind, and then last night, of course, the president's address to the Boy Scouts, which I found equally inappropriate, some of those comments. The attack on the media, on Jeff Sessions, on Barack Obama, on Hillary Clinton, on the Democrats as obstructionists, when in fact, for 8 years of the Democratic administration under Barack Obama, the Republican Party clearly acknowledged the fact that it was obstructionist. I mean, if you think back to Mitch McConnell making comments that his number one objective was to do everything he could to keep the president from getting anything through that he wanted to get through, which is one of the reasons why in the last months of his term in office, President Obama took to executive orders in order to try to circumvent the obstruction in Congress. So it is ironic for that party to now label Democrats as obstructionist. But I think it speaks volumes to the political situation that we've reached in the nation. So with that, I think as we all know, today's a pretty big day in the news. There's going to be a vote this afternoon or early this evening in the Senate on health care, whether to proceed with a debate on health care. And if you've been following this, Mitch McConnell has pretty much shaped this in such a way that the debate is limited to 20 hours. Filibusters are not permitted. In other words, if there is a debate, it's going to be pretty much of a pro forma. It's just going to be a show without any substance, I do believe. But like everybody else, I think we'll all be watching, because when we talk healthcare, if, according to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, if the Republican plan to repeal the Affordable Care Act and postpone replacement passes, then we're looking at an ultimate impact of denying health care to about 32 million people that currently have it. And it's almost like that doesn't even exist. So I think this is a very, very important issue. I do call your attention, and we'll maybe get into this a little bit in tomorrow's program. Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate for the Democrats, authored an op-ed piece Monday, I believe it was Monday, in the New York Times, in which he kind of outlined a new strategy, a new come-together kind of strategy for the Democrats, as the Democrats make every effort in the world to retake the mantle of populism that they've surrendered over the last several years, and begin to represent the interests of people once again. I thought it was pretty encouraging. So, but we can get to it tomorrow and look at a few of those comments. I mentioned at the outset of today's program, and we're about 15 minutes into today's program at this point, I mentioned that there was a piece on higher education that I had put together, and I have submitted it for publication in the Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia. It's the state newspaper, and it's there. And the editor has already contacted me that the fact that they have the piece, and I anticipate that it will be running fairly soon. I wanted to share that with you because I really do believe it's important. And I think in today's program, we're going to come into contact with some evidence, some material that indicates just how important that particular piece might be. One of the, and I've mentioned this before on more than one occasion, I've become a fairly big fan of a columnist who writes on a rather regular basis in the New York Times. I know he's retired. His name is Thomas Edsall. His insights on the nature of American two-party politics, I think, are incredibly sharp, incredibly perceptive. But what amazes me about Edsall as much as anything else is the up-to-date relevance of the information that he's sharing. It's been astounding to me as I read his column. It's usually about once a week he has a column. One of the things that has really astounded me is the number of contacts that Edsall seems to have in a variety of different professions around the country. And what he does is email. He uses email and gets email responses from a number of sociologists, political scientists, economists, demographers, etc., on some of the data that is really relevant, especially to our political system. I have found the material included in his columns to be invaluable because some of it is straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. He's not quoting from books they've written or articles they've written. He's quoting from emails that they've written him in response to direct questions. So I think that his columns tend to be very, very newsy, very, very valuable. The one that I'd like to call your attention to now is the one that was dated July 20th. Today we're the 25th, so it was 5 days ago. And it deals with Donald Trump's political base. The 25, every time I mention this, the number seems to go up, but the last number that I saw was the number of people on his Twitter account is approaching 30 million. It was, last I saw, 23 million. Now I'm seeing references to the fact that it's getting close to 30 million people who are recipients of his tweets, of these tweet storms that the president is so fond of engaging in. This one on July 20th is not really new because it's material that Thomas Edsall has addressed before. It deals with the nature of the base, those people who tend to continue to support Donald Trump, irrespective of gaffes he makes or errors he makes in speeches or whatever. It almost doesn't seem to matter. And in fact, I can remember on one of the more recent programs that we've done here, which would have been about 2 weeks ago, making reference to one comment about the extent to which somebody made the comment that the president doesn't seem to have any class. And this Trump supporter responded to that by making the statement that when you tell me that the president, that Donald Trump doesn't have class, that's fine, we'll buy that. But the reality is we don't care. And so what it points to is the fact that there seem to be reasons, real, substantive, deep, philosophical reasons why those people who support the president, who are the strongest in their support for the president, continue to stick with him irrespective of what might happen. As you know, we have all of these investigations going on, the House Intelligence Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee, special counsel, Mueller, all of them investigating possible fraud, possible collusion, possible illegal acts, violations of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, all of these things going on. And yet the polls are telling us that while the president's popularity continues to go down nationally, it's barely going down at all among his supporters. They are sticking with him, which essentially tells me that the issues that are being emphasized in criticism of President Trump are not the issues that these people care about. There's something else. And credit where credit is due, Thomas Edsall seems to me to be one of the first to have put his finger on this very elusive issue of the basis on which Trump's most ardent supporters continue to support him and refuse seemingly to abandon him. There's some evidence, I saw a piece this morning indicating that there's some evidence that there's a little bit of disintegration happening in the degree to which Republicans are willing to continue to support the president. There's some peel-off, some breaking down, if you will, of Republican support. And this is to me has been a fascinating situation all through the first 6 months of the Trump presidency. I've said here numerous times that Donald Trump seems to me to be providing cover for Republicans who are able to operate almost in the dark on putting together positions and policies on things like health care. Donald Trump is taking so much of the media attention. He's sucking up the media oxygen to the point that Republicans are pretty much getting away scot-free from media attention and investigation. The reality is that works both ways. Because the fact of the matter is, the fact that the Republicans who control both houses of Congress and the White House, along with so many state legislatures and governorships, are also providing cover for Donald Trump. If we had a 50-50 political split in this country between Democrats and Republicans, if every major political gaffe was going to cost you something, then I think the situation would be much different. But the fact that the Republicans have such a dominant, overwhelming degree of control means that they feel like, it appears, that they can afford the luxury of having Donald Trump go around and speak in ways and say things that offend people, offend constituencies, offend immigrants, foreigners, people of color, all the rest of it. So in a sense, it's almost a mutual relationship, if you will, between the Republican Party and the president. They make it possible for him to do what he's doing, and he in turn makes it possible for them to do what they're doing without having to own up all the time and operate in the light of day, so to speak. And again, I think Thomas Edsall, probably more than anybody, has been successful in pinpointing these issues that seem to drive Donald Trump's base. He says in this article, which is entitled, "How Fear of Falling Explains the Love of Trump," he says, "I've written before about the fear of falling down the socioeconomic ladder, fear of an irremediable loss of status, authority, prestige, and the desperate need to be rescued from this fate. But," he says, "the topic bears further exploration because it's been such a prime motivation for one slice of the electorate, the swing voters who made President Trump's unexpected triumph possible." And then he points out something we hear all the time about the November elections. 6 key states, Florida, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Florida, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, along with 220 counties nationwide, flipped from supporting Barack Obama in 2012 to voting for Donald Trump in 2016. Why did these voters change their mind? What is it that they saw in Donald Trump? Or what is it that they didn't like in the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton? Edsall points out that these are men and women who are, in the main, still working, still attending church, still members of functioning families, but who often live in communities where neighbors, relatives, friends, and children are caught up in disordered lives. The worry that this disorder is contagious and that decent working or middle class people can see their lives unravel quickly worries many voters, Edsall says, particularly in communities where jobs, industries, and a whole way of life have slowly receded, the culminating effect of which can feel, Edsall says, like a sudden blow. This morning on Morning Joe, right at the end of the program, in the 9 o'clock hour, toward the end of it, about 3/4 of the way through it, Joe Manchin, Democrat Joe Manchin from West Virginia, appeared on the program. And of course, he didn't say a word about the president's address to the Boy Scouts that happened last evening. But what he was talking about was the swing in West Virginia from a blue state to a red state. And he was talking about the lack of jobs and people's determination to try something else. Anything is better than what they see unfolding in front of them. That's the issue. Working people fearing drastic change in their lives seems to be the driving factor that seems to explain the solidity of the president's base of support. And then Edsall begins to consult the experts. The first one he consults is Arlie Hochschild, professor emeritus of sociology at Berkeley, author of Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. Hochschild speaks to what she calls the elite of the left behind. The elite of the left behind. He said, Edsall says, I think her findings shed light on that common refrain among these voters that America is going downhill and that, quote, our kids are headed for hard times, unquote. In these conversations, Hochschild says, this is a quote, it wouldn't take long before another topic spontaneously came up. Blacks, their problems, their call on government help. At the bottom of the imagined slide was the situation of blacks, teen single moms, kids out in the street at night, slacking off in school, drugs, drink, etc. So yes, she says, the feeling was, if we don't turn this thing around, that could be us, unquote. What she is basically referring to then is the decline that Black Americans experienced in some of our major cities a few decades ago. The inability to get jobs, unemployment rate among teens, all the rest of it. And now these people see the same thing possibly happening to them. Thus the title of Edsall's article, How Fear of Falling Explains the Love of Trump. Then Edsall goes to, and I think most of us are familiar with this name, Nancy Eisenberg, history professor at Louisiana State University, who's the author of the current bestseller White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. And in that, she talks about Americans who are anxious about losing their place. And here's a quote. Yes, she says, the fear was about rearranging the pecking order. But many working class and middle class whites without college educations also hate poor whites, who they see as lazy and worthless. Historically, poor whites have shared the same stereotypes applied to poor blacks. Lazy, uncouth, living on handouts, and not just having too many children, but practicing inbreeding, unquote. Basically, then, what Nancy Isenberg has put her finger on is a split within the white community between working class people and those people who are on some sort of government program. And they feel that they're just in it for the free ride, that they lack initiative, that they're lazy, that they're just trying to basically establish dependency on government to take care of them, and that they are unwilling to work. The point she makes is that working class whites hate that group. And that's the comment that she's making. In 2017, the paperback edition of her book, White Trash, came out. And in a new preface, she said the following: "The election has opened up festering wounds. The deepest of these exposes how we measure the value of civic virtue and hard work. The 2016 campaign," she says, "tapped into anxieties of all who resented the government for handing over the country to supposedly less deserving classes, new immigrants, protesting African Americans, lazy welfare freeloaders, and Obamacare recipients asking for handouts. Angry Trump voters were convinced that these classes, the takers, were not playing by the rules, working their way up the ladder, and that government entitlement programs were allowing some to advance past the more deserving white native-born Americans. This is how many came to feel disinherited." So again, what Isenberg is speaking to are the anxieties over the number of people who have become overly dependent on government and aren't looking for work, but rather continue to look for ways to avoid work. Their sense is that not only are these people getting away with it, but at times it appears that government programs are actually elevating them ahead of the people who do work, who are doing it the way it's supposed to be done, as the expression goes. I'm thinking of those programs where people on public assistance, on Medicaid or whatever, get cell phones, can get reduced costs or free cell phone service, as well as many other kinds of public assistance. So that's really where Nancy Isenberg's attention is in her book called White Trash. Edsel makes the comment that there really isn't any question that the communities which backed President Trump, rural to small city America, are in many ways on a downward trajectory. There's no question. This is where the hurt is. This is where the danger is. And I think Senator Manchin from West Virginia this morning made that point. There just aren't any jobs here. My wife and I were commenting that, as I mentioned, her son is an officer in the Navy, and he's based in Groton, Connecticut. And he was telling us that because of some of the contracts to build ships in Connecticut, in Groton and New London and those places, there are rumored to be as many as 10,000 jobs being created there. Good paying jobs. Obviously tied to the military, to the defense establishment. Here, nothing. And I think Senator Manchin made reference to that this morning. What is the impact of this downward trajectory that Edsel speaks about? Here are some numbers that shocked me. From 1990 to 2009, 20 years, 19 years, the percentage of births to single mothers among whites without high school diplomas grew from 21 to 51%. Think on that for a moment. In a 20-year period from 1990 to 2009, the percentage of births to single mothers among whites without a high school education grew from 21% to 51%. Among those who completed high school, the percentage rose from 11% to 34%. Basically, then, what we're seeing among poor whites in this country is a repeat of the situations that existed in the 1960s and 70s in this country in the inner cities. We are seeing white working class Americans going through the same kind of family disintegration and disorientation that black Americans experienced a generation ago. More numbers. Along parallel lines, Edsel says, the percentage of intact marriages among white adults between 25 and 60 without high school degrees fell from 70% in the 1970s to 36% in the 2000s. For those who did finish high school, the percentage fell from 76 to 46%. Intact marriages, two-partner marriages. In the 1970s, even those without a high school diploma were involved in stable marriage relationships. 70% of them were. Now, in today's country, that number has gone from 70% down to 36%. And for those who completed high school, the percentage of intact marriages dropped from 76% to 46%. Not only is the issue one of jobs, but rather the issue is one of marriage, of stability, of institutional stability, of the way we raise children, of bringing up children in a two-parent household. All of those things which we've always put such a premium on are rapidly disappearing, as they did for black Americans a generation ago. In 2010, the Institute for American Values at the University of Virginia published a report 7 years ago entitled When Marriage Disappears, the New Middle America. And this study found that the downward path of those without college degrees stood in direct contrast to the experiences of those who did have college degrees. College graduates, the report said, this was in 2010, quote, have in recent years been largely unaffected by the tidal wave of family change that first hit the poor in the 1960s and has since moved higher into middle America. Indeed, highly educated Americans, who make up 30% of the adult population, now enjoy marriages that are as stable and happy as those from 4 decades ago. So that's the difference. The college education and what impact it has on the likelihood of people being involved in secure, stable marriages. For generations, sociologists have pointed out that a major factor in Americans' historical development through its history has been the institution of marriage. I think all of us will recognize that most of the jails and most of the prisons built in the United States are built to accommodate single men. It has traditionally been single males who are most likely to become lawbreakers, who are most likely to do time, whether it be in local jails, state jails, or federal jails or penitentiaries. Early on, sociologists pointed out that the institution of marriage was a major counter to deviant behavior among young males. The idea, the need for a job, steady income, the quest to own your own home, raising children and the responsibilities that go with it. All of these things play a significant part in limiting people's adult males' willingness to sow their oats, so to speak. It's pretty obvious then that with these statistics on disintegrating marriages in middle America now, it's going to have an impact on crime, on opiate addiction, on alcoholism, on abuse, physical and psychological abuse. All of these things are associated with the breakdown of intact, stable, secure marriage relationships. Sociologists have recognized that for a long time. In the 60s and 70s, these were the kinds of sociological research studies that were pointing out the dysfunction within black families in the inner city. Now, however, we're seeing the same kind of disintegration happening in rural America among whites. Edsel points out, and this I think is astounding, that the problems don't stop there. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 2014, 3 years ago, reported the number of opioid prescriptions outnumbered the number of people in 12 states. More opioid prescriptions were written in these 12 states than there were people living in them, which means people were getting multiple prescriptions. All 12 of these states voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Arkansas, Alabama, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia. That is amazing. every one of those 12 states experiencing major opioid problems voted for Donald Trump. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, the death rates from overdose in 2015 for opioids, including heroin, were far higher for whites than they were for blacks. For whites, 13.9 per 100,000 people. For blacks, 6.6 per 100,000 people. For Hispanics, 4.6 per 100,000 people. These devastating conditions and circumstances are having a ripple effect throughout the entire society. It's causing the disintegration of families. It's eliminating the degree to which the institution of marriage has been able to stabilize deviant male behavior in American society up until this point. We saw it happen in the inner cities in the 60s and 70s. Now, we're seeing its effects in Middle America. Joan Williams, a law professor at the University of California, Hastings, wrote a book entitled The White Working Class: Overcoming Class Cluelessness in America. In an email to Thomas Edsall, Joan Williams described how the downward trends are affecting Donald Trump's electorate. Working class whites, she says, are deeply upset that they are losing traditional family structures. As you know, the divorce rate and rate of unmarried childbearing in the professional managerial elite have remained close to what they were in 1960, whereas whites in the missing middle now are experiencing sharply higher rates of non-marital childbearing and family dissolution, which of course hit black families a generation earlier, given that they lost access to the blue-collar jobs that kept family life stable a generation earlier. The white working class is mighty upset about that. In a sense, then, the lack of jobs, of opportunities, and the associated dependence on government programs throughout Middle America is having an impact on families, on children, on bringing children into the world in one-parent homes, and all the impacts of that. The same book by Joan Williams argues that the liberal elite maintains a set of values: self-expression, creativity, personal fulfillment, that are totally different from the values of those in the missing middle, but a threat to their economic survival. Quote, valuing hard work means having the right self-discipline to do a menial job you hate for 40 years and reining yourself in so you don't have an attitude. Hard work for elites is associated with self-actualization. Disruption means founding a successful startup. Disruption in working class jobs gets you fired. And finally, another factor, which is, these are very, very difficult to get your arms around. But I think if you think about it, they're clearly real. And that is, increasingly the number of jobs being lost, disappearing, are jobs that traditionally were done by men. The jobs that are left are traditionally the jobs that were mostly done by women. They are jobs that aren't really very appealing to men. Claire Miller, in The Upshot, wrote the following this past January in the New York Times, quote, "It hasn't been a great time to be a man without a job. The jobs that have been disappearing, like machine operator, are predominantly those that men do. The occupations that are growing, like health aide, employ mostly women." And then they quote a 53-year-old welder struggling to find work in Missouri. He said, quote, "I ain't going to be a nurse. I don't have the tolerance for people. I don't want it to sound bad, but I've always seen a woman in the position of a nurse or some kind of healthcare worker. I see it as more of a woman's touch." And Joan Williams concludes from that, talk about insensitivity, encouraging men with high school educations only to take pink, what they see as pink-collar jobs. Elite men, she says, are not flooding into traditionally feminine work. To recommend that for white working class men fuels class anger. So we got a problem in this country, it seems to me, a real problem. Because the jobs that are disappearing aren't being replaced by new jobs. Rather, the jobs that are being left available are usually the jobs that were reserved for women. And it violates the sense of macho. All of that feeling, all that psychology has an impact on the raising of kids, on the stability of marriage, all of it. Edsel says that whites without bachelor's degrees flocked to Donald Trump because they believed he was their savior. The reality is that the problems they face are way beyond what Donald Trump could address, even if he wanted to. And it's not clear at all that beyond getting votes, he was very committed to these people. They are, Edsel said, caught up in a cycle. The National Institutes of Health, in a paper entitled Family Inequality, addresses the cycle. In brief, the report says, the vicious cycle works as follows. The declining employment and salaries of men without college degrees make them less attractive as marriage partners. The result is a decoupling of marriage and childbearing, according to the authors of this study, with larger percentages of children brought up in single-mother households. In contrast, those who hold bachelor's degrees at college see marriage as being a commitment device that supports intensive investments in children. For less well-educated parents with limited resources and uncertain futures, the returns on investment are likely to be lower than for the more educated parents with greater and more secure investment capabilities. These intensive investments in children, marked by things like higher child care time, growing expenditures on children, tend to be associated with those with a college education. Those without one, more often than not, children are being born into single-parent households. Conclusion: social and economic changes have reduced the value of marriage to non-college graduates and in turn may be responsible for an effect on men's behavior. Carol Graham, who's at the Brookings Institute, a senior fellow there, has co-authored a study, and she says there's a high cost of failing to keep up in a very wealthy society that prides itself on being a meritocracy. These costs, Graham says, are reflected as follows. The increase in premature mortality among significant sectors of our society due to preventable deaths like suicide, opioid and drug overdoses, heart, liver, and lung diseases. These deaths are most prevalent among uneducated middle-aged whites in rural areas. We talked about this before, the fact that white working class males in America was the only group that was seeing a decline in life expectancy rather than an increase. All other groups, people were living longer, except this group. As these processes continue and accelerate, she said, many Trump voters, the neighbors, relatives, friends, parents, and children of those who have become mired in what the author calls the geography of desperation, are deeply apprehensive about what might happen if Donald Trump fails to fulfill his promise to make America great again. I think that is an incredibly important article. It is chock full of perspective and information. Think about it. Think about a society which is rapidly losing jobs. Jobs that are being replaced by jobs that many men don't feel qualified or comfortable filling. The result is that marriages are disintegrating. Raising children is no longer a priority in these people's lives. There's no question that middle-class working America is undergoing the same kinds of sociological changes that occurred among urban blacks a generation ago. The vote for Donald Trump, Edsel believes, and I believe, because I've read so much of this evidence and information that it's almost, to me, beyond dispute. That's the desperation that caused these people to look to Donald Trump. That's the desperation that enables them to overlook flaws in the man's character, in his presidency, in his foreign policy, and all the rest of it. What these people are most interested in is change that Donald Trump got elected to produce, but so far has not happened. One must wonder what will happen if nothing changes. I think the Democratic Party's commitment, avowed commitment, because now they're saying it publicly, to reassume the mantle of populism and beginning to put forth programs and policies aimed principally at working people is significant. The New Deal saved America during the Great Depression. Major programs, investment programs, housing programs, jobs programs, and the rest of it. It seems to me that we're in the market for a similar kind of program. However, we've elected an administration and a Congress that doesn't agree. I'm particularly struck by the quotations in there about the hostility between working whites and non-working whites, the so-called poor white trash. I think it's very significant. I think the president was able to take advantage of that in attacking big government, in attacking Obamacare. There's absolutely no question that these are the issues driving the healthcare debate. Let's not for a moment forget or overlook or ignore the degree to which these issues are really driving that debate. If we had unanimity in this country about providing health care to people as a human right, then finding ways to do it, to make it work, would be entirely possible. The reason that it's becoming such a crisis, I believe, is because there's so much of this idea of certain people deserving of assistance and other people not deserving of it. I quoted, I don't like to overly quote this one person, but the one I can't get out of my mind is Tom Cotton of Arkansas, when he talked about unemployed people. People who don't work don't need health care. And the implication is health care coverage was a reward for work. That's the way you earn the right to have assistance in delivering health care to you and your family. And so basically the idea that we expanded the Medicaid rolls and allowed all of these people to buy into health care or to become eligible for health care, being paid for by other people, offends so many people in positions of power today that it's really unclear what's going to happen. So again, I think there's much more involved here than just the inability to find a decent paying job. There's much more involved with it. Things like attitude. Very, very important. I mentioned the proposal. I've mentioned numerous times the education proposal that myself and some of my colleagues have been putting together on education, on job training and college education. As I mentioned, I've submitted this to the Charleston Gazette, and I'm awaiting publication of it. I entitled this piece, Eskimos and Ice Cubes, Meaningful Higher Education in West Virginia. It seems to me to fit perfectly into the data that we just looked at in Thomas Edsel's piece. Where did I get this idea of ice cubes and Eskimos? Remember the old adage about trying to convince people to do something that they really didn't even want to hear? And the old expression, it's like trying to sell ice cubes to Eskimos. In other words, it's a darn tough sell. asking college instructors, teachers, professors to think differently about what they do is the issue. Coming to grips with reality in today's classroom environment is the key obstacle. What is that obstacle? That there's only one way to do what we do, and we're already doing it. That's the standard response. We have talked to one after the other, educators, administrators, college administrators, etc. And we get the same response. What we do works. What you're proposing isn't necessary, because with financial aid as available as it is, those people who want to get an education can get one. End of story. By submitting this piece to the Gazette, I'm kind of doing an end run around these obstacles. I'm stepping outside the box, so to speak. However, there's one major difference between educational reform and ice cubes for Eskimos. Eskimos may never buy ice cubes, but they use them, and they like them. They don't disavow them, nor do they deny ice cubes to people whose lives might benefit most from having them. Educators that we've approached with this proposal have done both. Not only do they claim that it's unnecessary, but they actually tend to dismiss the ability of the people to be served as being capable of education. The driving assumption that really forms the heart of higher education thinking, it seems to me, and to my colleagues, we've all talked about this and kind of agree on it, is that these people believe that the people who can be educated are being educated. And the other side of that coin, of course, is that those who aren't being educated can't be. I would suggest to you that that tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. That pretty much defines what we're doing. That also speaks to the fact that what we're doing isn't working, especially in the face of the data and specifics that we've looked at through the eyes of Thomas Edsall in today's program. West Virginia's economy contains thousands of undereducated, untrained adults unable to find meaningful work or even their own potential because they can't find ways to access higher education or the skills training they need desperately. For some of them, it's fear. They're afraid. Their first trip through school wasn't a very good one. In fact, for many of them, it was horrible. The only thing they learned was that education, school, was not for them. And given the trouble they're having finding work, meaningful work, that's about all they learned. For many of the others, they find themselves caught in a current life situation that seems to leave no space, no room for education or training. They live in rural, isolated communities. They have very significant family responsibilities. They exist or come from dysfunctional home lives. They don't have any money. They don't have any incentives. They don't have any support. They don't interact with people who have been successful in education. They don't have any role models. For many of them, they're trapped by a series of bad choices. They're afraid to take on a system that they don't really know how to navigate. Education happens in buildings that are foreign to them, that scare them. They know when they go, they're going to be faced with mountains of paperwork that scare them. I can remember a situation in West Virginia when I first came here in the early 1970s. It was a student I had in class. And she came from a totally dysfunctional marriage. And clearly divorce was going to happen. And her husband actually started to physically threaten her about going to school. He found the education to be a real threat because it threatened his ability to control. And he threatened physical abuse if it didn't stop. And I asked her about her own safety. And she said, as long as I'm here in college, as long as I'm in this campus, as long as I'm interacting with other students and faculty members, I'm safe. Because he fears this place. He's frightened by this place, by the people. He doesn't understand any of this. He wants me out of it. He'll never venture into it. The fact of the matter is, what the particular situation is that's inhibiting or preventing the pursuit of education or meaningful job training isn't really the issue. The issue, the problem, is bigger than any one person. It's a problem for this state. It's a problem for thousands of this state's people. Educators believed, I can remember this when I was in school, educators believed that television, then the internet, would alleviate the problems associated with delivery of education. When you say the words delivery of education, you are defining education as a commodity. And the implication is all you got to do is deliver it. The fact of the matter is, and too few people in education are willing to admit this, we have allowed the medium to become the message. We slid into a habit of defining the content of our classes as if they were the education. So naturally we assumed that if we evaluate or measure the student's ability to memorize information, we are getting an accurate reading of education, their educational achievement or level. The fact is, education is not a commodity. Education is a process. Education is what happens within a student when that student engages content, engages the material. If there's no engagement, there's no education. Consequently, just having access to information does not equate to education. It's what happens to the student as a result of being exposed to that education. That is the measure of education. And indeed, it can be measured. You can measure it in each individual student by looking at the progress they made as their world becomes bigger and bigger, their horizons become broader and broader. It's learning that's driven by content, but the content is not the education. What is the education are the skills that a student must possess in order to engage content that they are being asked to learn. So in a sense, and I've talked about this before, it's very deep and abstract, I know, but I think it's very important. It's based on the idea that how well we learn something is pretty much determined by what we already know. It's making the connections, the links, seeing similarities and differences that really constitutes education. If you don't know anything, then every piece of new information you encounter is isolated. You have no option except to memorize it because it doesn't connect to anything. You don't have anything to connect it to. So the fact of the matter is then that your ability to learn is driven by what you already know. And if you carefully structure that process and you arrange or manage the introduction of new materials so that it links to materials that the student obviously already has, then you can, in a sense, oversee or manage the educational process. But it's the student who educates himself or herself. Because as these skills develop, as students become more and more capable at learning new things that they encounter, they become self-learners. The teacher teaches them how to use it and how to apply the skills. But education only happens when the skills are applied. History tells us that what's worked in higher education in the past and has worked well has been principally for the few. All of us are familiar at the beginning of college with so-called general education classes. These are the classes like Introduction to Business, Introduction to Sociology, Introduction to Psychology, Introduction to Political Science, Introduction to History, etc., etc. And the whole idea of these intro classes is to build a broad base of knowledge. But the fact of the matter is, if the student is not encouraged to engage the content, then that broad base of knowledge never materializes. What we know now through research is that these intro classes at the beginning of college serve principally not as the building the solid base of knowledge, rather they serve as ability filters. They weed out students. They discriminate. They separate the brightest students from the mediocre students from the weak students. we know that the smartest, brightest 25 to 30% are going to be able to handle the challenge. For the rest, these classes generate the kind of data that allows counselors to distribute them into the less challenging majors. These intro classes, for example, in math and physics and natural science and chemistry and biology and all the rest of it, what they do is reveal the people with a real talent. What do they do for everybody else? They basically say you can't go into any area that requires math or science or foreign languages. And so what happens is students tend to be redistributed into less challenging majors, most of them in service delivery, things like healthcare, teaching. And for about a third of incoming freshmen every year, these 100 level classes do only one thing. They convince these students that they don't belong there. And so they leave. And we've seen it year after year, institution after institution. 25 to 30% of students who start in the fall of the year as freshmen don't come back for spring semester. Or if they do, they don't come back for the following fall, for their sophomore year. So what's the challenge? We're dealing with a world, Edsel gave us the data to show us that we are confronted by a world which requires that everybody have skills. Everybody be able to learn. We can't continue to function by providing high-quality education to 30% of our student population and writing off the other 70%. And the data is showing us that it doesn't work. So what we've got to do, and I know we've only got about 2 minutes left, what we've got to do is turn the entire process around. We've got to restructure our classes so that they don't emphasize delivery of new information, but rather they emphasize competencies and real challenging learning experiences so that they build skills, so that they teach students all they need to know and what they must be able to do in order to be successful. That means we've got to begin to focus our educational efforts on the people that traditionally we've allowed to fall through the cracks. I would suggest to you, this is the population that Edsel's research is exposing us to, is making us aware of. And we have a plan to do this. And I'll probably begin tomorrow's program by sharing that plan with you. But today, we do not have time. We're like 1 minute before the top of the hour. I want to thank you so much for your continued support of this program. More importantly, for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network. Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and those folks do an astounding job. And I encourage you to do everything you can to help them in their work, because it's important work. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be back live, how much I'm looking forward to being with you tomorrow. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's program here on the Virtual Center. Remember, tomorrow we'll be starting at our regular time, 30 minutes earlier, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. For Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On Radio Network, and for the Virtual Center, I want to thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other. And thank you again.